React context. Firstly, let's recap. In the previous session, we have taken the Windows app example and we understood about context using this example, right? So firstly, the component structure was there's an app component. Within that, we have the header, landing section and feature section. And within the feature section, we have the playtime and new ways to connect. So here, firstly, the active language was being passed as a prop to the components, right? And we understood that there is an issue of prop drilling here, right? So we were passing the active language from the app component to playtime and new ways to connect through the feature section. Though the feature section doesn't need the active language, even then we were passing that to the feature section so that it can be passed down to playtime and new ways to connect. So that was prop drilling. And we understood that prop drilling would be an issue as the application grows because the number of props that we have to pass will increase. Unnecessarily, we have to involve a lot of components, right? So the solution for this is using context. Context is actually a mechanism using which we can make data available to all the components, right? So we also understood about how to create the context. So we'll write react.createContext of, and we'll provide the initial value for the context. So this will return an object, the context object, which is language context here, and we'll export it, and we can make use of this language context in various other components, right? So in the language context, we have the active language. So we have initialized it with English. And then there is change language, a method using which we can update the active language. Currently, it is empty. Okay, so this was the context that we have created. And then we have seen about how to access the context value, right? So for that, we'll use the consumer component of the context, right? So we'll write the context object dot consumer. So that is a component. Within that, we'll have a callback function to which the context value will be passed as an argument. You can see there, there's value. So the context value will be passed as an argument. And within the callback function, we can access the context value through that. Okay, clear? So we understood about all of this, right? And we have made use of this consumer components in various other components like header, landing section, playtime, and new ways to connect. And we have seen the outputs. Now, coming to today's session. In today's session, we will see about how we can update the context value. So far, we have seen about how to access the context value, right? So let's see about how we can update the context value. So for that, we have the provider component. We'll understand about that. And then we'll also understand about the flow. So the context, provider, consumer, how the flow exists. We'll understand about that too. Okay. So to get started, set the code playground for today's session. And then run npm install, then all the dependencies will get installed. Finally, run npm start and you will be able to see these outputs. So in the language context, so if the initial value for active language is English, so this would be the output. And if it is Hindi, this would be the output, right? Okay. Now, coming to the drop down. Okay, so there's a drop down, and if you are trying to change the language using the drop down, so the change is not reflected, right? You can see that even if we select some other language, the change wouldn't be reflected. The reason here is, so to change the entire content, we are making use of the change language, this method in the context. But the change language method is currently an empty function. So that's the reason the change is not reflected. Okay, so we are calling this change language method, but it's an empty function. So no change is getting triggered here. Okay, so let's understand about how we can change the language. So firstly, let me show you the output. So here, let me just go to the context. So currently the active language is English, and you can see that here we have the English content. Let me change it to Hindi. So here you can see that the content is Hindi. So now if I'm trying to change the option here in the drop down, still the change is not reflected. The reason here is, so if we go to the header component, so what are we doing here? Okay, so when there is a change, so the onChange language method is being called, and within that we are calling the change language. So which is from the context, right? Within the consumer, from the context we are accessing the change language method, and we are calling that whenever the drop down option is changed. Coming to the context, the change language is actually an empty method. So that's the reason here the change is not being triggered. Okay, so now we have to update this appropriately, and we have to update the context value here, right? The active language that is present in the context has to be updated based on the drop down selection, right? So let's have a look at how we can achieve this. Okay, so we understood this output, why it's not working. So now let's see how we can update the context value. So for that, we have the provider component. So the provider component is used to update the context value. So this provider component will update the context value, okay? And then automatically the consumer components will get re-rendered with the new updated value, okay? So here the provider will update the value of the context, okay? Then once the context value has been updated, so then the consumers will get re-rendered. So wherever we are accessing this context value will get re-rendered with the new value, with the updated value. Okay, so here there's one important point to note. That is, only the consumer components which are nested within the provider, only they will get re-rendered. Okay, when the provider updates the context, only the consumer components which are nested inside the provider component, only those will be re-rendered. Only the nested consumer components within the provider will be re-rendered when the context value is updated. Another important point to note is the updated context value can only be accessed by the consumer components which are nested within the provider. It's important here, right? So the provider will update the context value. Now, the consumers have to be re-rendered. So only the consumers which are nested within the provider will be re-rendered, and the updated value will only be accessible to the components that are the consumer components that are nested within the provider. Okay, that is very, very important here. So you understood this, right? So the provider should actually cover the consumer components that have to be re-rendered so that they'll be appropriately updated and we'll be able to see the output. Okay, we'll understand it as we go further. Okay, coming to the syntax of the provider component, it's just like the consumer. So we use the dot notation. We'll write the context object dot provider. So this provider is a component and we'll write it in this way. And then we'll provide the value, the updated value as a prop to the provider component. You can see their value equal to. So we'll give the updated value as a prop to the provider component. There you can see, we'll pass it as a prop to the provider component. Okay, so now the question is, okay, we understood about how to write the provider component, and we understood that using the provider component, we can update the context value. So now, where do we have to write the provider component? So where do I have to write this? Let's understand this first. So where should we write the provider component? Okay. So as we previously understood, so the provider component, so when it updates the context value, all the consumer components that are nested within the provider will get updated, and the updated value will only be accessible to the nested consumer components. So obviously the provider component should be written at a place where the consumer components are nested within the provider. So all the consumer components that needs to be updated based on the context value should be nested within the provider. Okay, and also, here we are trying to update the context value. So where the state and the functions that are necessary to update the context value are available, there we have to place the provider. So the question here was, where should we write the provider, right? So first thing is the consumer components that have to be updated based on the context value should be nested within the provider. So we have to place the provider in such a way that the consumer components that have to be updated should be nested within them. At the same time, so the state and the functions that are necessary to update the context value should be available at that place. So that's where we have to place the provider. Okay. So now in our Windows app example, let's understand where do we have to place it. Okay. So firstly, if we update the active language, so what are the consumer components that have to get updated? First, let's understand about them. So we have the consumer components at the header, landing section, playtime, and new ways to connect, right? So these are the 4 components. And when the active language updates, okay, so when the active language has been updated, so all these 4 components should get re-rendered, right? So with the new active language, based on that, the content that needs to be displayed will change, right? So all these 4 components have to be re-rendered. The consumer components have to be re-rendered, right? So we have to place the provider so that the header, landing section, playtime, and new ways to connect are nested within the provider, right? So you can see that we only have one option, that is app component. So app component encloses all the consumer components. At the same time, it has the active language and change language, right? So we want to update the active language, which is present in the state of app component, and the change language method is also present in the app component. So the state and the functions are available in the app component. At the same time, it will enclose all the consumers. So we can write the provider at the app component, right? So whenever you're building an application, so now if you want to write a provider component, so you have to ask yourself 2 questions. The first thing is, what are the consumers that needs to get updated, that needs to get re-rendered? So question that. So based on that, you will understand them. Okay. So now you have to choose the component that will enclose all these consumers. At the same time, the next question that you have to ask is, so where do I have the state and the functions that are necessary to update the context value? So look for that components also. Okay. And based on that, you have to take a decision about where you have to write the provider component. So in our case, it's very straightforward. That is the app, right? So the app will enclose all the consumer components that have to be re-rendered, and also it has the state and the change language method, right? So it's appropriate. Okay. So let's write the provider component in the app component. Okay. So here you can see that within the state, we have the active language, right? And then we already have a function change language using which we are updating the state with a new active language. So appropriately the render method will be called and everything will be re-rendered, right? So it's appropriate to write the provider component in the app component. So let's do that. So here you can see that within the render method, so we are writing the provider component. So firstly, we have imported the context, the language context dot provider, and you can see that there. And here you can see that the header, landing section, and feature section, all these are placed inside the provider component, right? They are nested inside the provider component. So this will ensure that all the consumer components that have to be updated are nested within the provider. That's what we understood, right? So the consumer components have to be nested within the provider, right? So here, since we have written the header, landing section, feature section inside the provider component, so now they all will be nested within the provider component and we can get them re-rendered. Okay, clear? Now, coming to the value. So here, we have to provide the updated value, right? So you can see there that it is present in the state. So we are accessing it from the state and we are passing that. And we are also providing the change language method. Okay. Here there's one important point to note. The context will store a single value. Okay, it's always a single value. So here currently the value is an object with the active language as a key and change language as a key, right? So context is always a single value. Okay, that's clear, right? So here, whenever we are updating the context, okay, so if we are passing an object, we have to ensure that all the key value pairs are present. So what context does is, so what provider does is, so we'll give an object or some value, right? So it will replace the context value with a new value, right? So in case if you don't provide some key value pairs, so in the new context value, they won't be present. So you have to provide all the key value pairs while updating. Okay, so here you can see that the active language, change language. So these two are the keys in our context. So they both have to be provided while updating. Okay. So even if there's no change in a particular key, even then you have to provide that because the entire object will get replaced. Okay, this is an important point here to know. Okay, so coming back to us. So we have written the provider component. We have enclosed all the consumer components within it since the header, landing section, and feature section are placed inside it. And we are providing the updated value. So you can see that we have the active language and change language. When it comes to the change language, we are providing the change language method in the app component. So that's where we are updating the active language in the state and all this, right? So that's why we are providing this. Okay, instead of an empty function, which was the initial value, now we are providing the actual method using which the active language will get updated. Okay, clear? So this is the provider component, right? So let's write this provider component now. So firstly, as we understood, we are going to write the provider component in the app component. The reason is, so it will enclose all the consumer components that have to be updated. And we also have the active language, the state and the functions that are necessary to update the context value, right? So that's the reason we are placing it in the app component. Okay. So here you can see that we have header, landing section, and feature section. So these are the three components which contain the consumer components, right? So here we are going to enclose all these within the provider. Okay, firstly, let me import the language context from /context/language context. Okay, so the notation is language context dot provider. Okay, this is how we write it. Okay, now to the provider, to this component, we'll pass the new context value as a prop. So value equal to, and we have to provide the new value. Okay, so now here coming to the value, it is an object, right? So let me provide that object. So here the keys in the object are active language and change language. So you can have a look at the context. You can see active language and change language. While updating, it's very important that you pass all the key value pairs, okay, because the entire object will get replaced by the provider. Okay, so firstly we have the active language. Since that is already present in the state, I'm directly passing that. Next we have the change language. Okay, coming to the change language, you can see that we have a method here where we are updating the state and all this. So this is a method that we have to maintain in the context, so I'm passing that here. Okay, so with this I'm done providing the new value, the new context value to the provider. So now what will happen? The provider will update the context value and all the nested consumer components will get re-rendered and we'll be able to see the output. So since now we have provided the change language method appropriately, so when the drop down option selection will happen, so this method, this change language method will be called, where we are updating the active language. So with this, the state will get updated and this entire render method will be called, the consumer components will be re-rendered and we'll be able to see the output. So shall we have a look at it? Okay. So here you can see currently it's in English. Let me change. So see, it's Hindi now. Okay. So let me write. So Telugu, like this, whatever language that you want to choose. Okay. See, appropriately now the drop down is working. Right. Now let's go back to the slides. So we have written the provider component at the app component, so which encloses all the consumer components that have to be updated, right? So, and we have seen this final output. So with the drop down selection change, the content has been appropriately updated, right? So when you choose English, we have the English content. When we choose Hindi, we have the Hindi content, right? And so on, whichever language option we have, okay? So now, coming to how does this context work? Let's just get a brief understanding about it, okay? So here, once the state gets updated, the render method will be called. And within the render method, we will write the provider, right? So the provider component will be present within the render method. So there, we'll be passing the new value to the provider. So now the provider component will update the context value. So previously, there was initial value. Now we'll update the context with the new value. So once the context gets updated, all the consumer components that are nested within the provider component will get re-rendered. Okay, so you understood the flow, right? So when the state gets updated, the render method will be called. So when the render method is called, within that we have the provider. So to the provider, we pass the new value, right? So the provider will update the context with the new value. Then since the context has been updated, all the consumer components nested within the provider will get re-rendered with the new value. Okay. So this is how it works. Okay. So now let's understand the flow specific to the Windows app that we have taken. Okay. So here, firstly, we have the drop down in the header component, right? So there we'll select a particular language. When there is a change in the drop down selection, the on change event will be triggered, right? So the on change event will get triggered. So then when this gets triggered, the change language method of app component is being called. Okay, in the change language method of app component, so we are updating the state. We are updating the active language of the state. Okay, so since the state has been updated, the render method of the app component will get called. And within the render method, we have the provider component, right? So now the provider component will have the new value from the state. So since the value has been passed to the provider component, so the context will be updated. Right? So once the context has been updated, all the components that are nested within the provider will get re-rendered. Okay? So this is a flow that happens. So now let's understand this through the code also. Okay? So I'll start off with the header component. So here you can see that we have the select element. So this is the drop down. So when there's a change in the drop down selection, right? So the on change event will be triggered. So that is calling this on change language. So which is calling the change language method. So here the change language method is nothing but the change language method present in the app component, because we are setting the context with this method, right? So here you can see. So the change language in the context is nothing but this method. So here what we are doing, we are updating the state with a new selection of active language. Okay, you can see that the active language in the state is being updated. So once the state is being updated, so the render method will be called. Now we have the new selection here in the active language. And here we have the provider component. So the provider component will update the context value. We are passing the new value to the provider component. Now the provider component will update the context value. Okay, so once the context value has been updated, all the consumer components that are nested within the provider will get re-rendered. And we are able to see this output, right? So based on the selection, so you can see that the change language is being called, the state will be updated. Since the state is updated, the provider component will be called with the new value. So then all the consumer components will be re-rendered, and that's the reason we are able to see all the components with the updated content. Okay. So I hope you understood the brief overview of it. Okay, so you can just give it a try. You will understand there are a lot of steps involved. So just give it a try. Just see how the state is being changed. Okay, you can add some console log statements. You can use the React developer tools and see how it's being changed. Okay, and you'll get the understanding. Okay, clear? Now, here you might have a small question. Okay, so you might be wondering that why are we maintaining the change language in the context? See, the change language method is only being used at the header component, right? So that's the only place, and there is no prop drilling. We understood that we have to use the context when a particular data should be available for a lot of components. At the same time, there is a prop drilling issue. That's when we'll make use of the context, right? But here, if we observe the change language, specific to change language, it's only being used at the header component, and there is no prop drilling. But still, why did we maintain it in the context? So the answer here is that using the change language method, we are updating the active language, the context data. So generally in the context, there's a best practice that we should also maintain the required functions to update the data in the context. So here the change language is the function using which we update the active language. So we have to maintain that in the context. That is a best practice. Okay. The reason here is now we just are using this in the header. Later on, let's say in the profile settings, we are updating the language, or let's say somewhere else in other component. So we want to update this active language. So in all of these cases, we need this change language method. That is a common requirement. So if we have to update the context value, the corresponding function to update the context value should also be present in the context. This session, we understood about how to update the context value. For that, we'll make use of the provider component. And we also understood about where exactly do we have to write the provider component. Firstly, it has to enclose all the consumer components that have to be updated. At the same time, it should be placed where we have access to the data so that we can update the context, like the state, the functions should be available so that we can update the context. So appropriately, we have to choose the place where we have to write the provider component. Okay, and we also understood about the flow, how it works, how the provider, consumer, and the context work hand in hand. Okay, so in the next session, we'll continue